Good afternoon. We move on with the plenary sessions. For the afternoon, you can see your participant book, the detail of the sessions and the schedules. The first presentation this afternoon is on the implications of aging for macroeconomic performance. Sounds a bit difficult, but we have a presenter who can really explain the trends that are happening in terms of economic growth and aging. And that is Philip O'Keefe. He's lead economist in the Social Protection and Labor Global Practice at the World Bank, working in East Asia and Pacific. Previously, he was lead economist for human development for East Asia Pacific and sector coordinator for human development for China and Mongolia. He's the lead author of the groundbreaking study work on the World Bank Report 2016, which is called Live Long and Prosper, and you can get some abbreviated copies outside. He has published regularly on social security, labor market issues, and East and South Asia and transition economies. So welcome, Pip, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eduardo, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for returning from lunch. It's always the most difficult part of any conference. And thank you. I'd like first to thank HelpAge, Government of Vietnam and UNFPA for inviting me to speak and for putting together such a wonderful and diverse crowd in terms of types of people, countries of people, and perspectives. So as Eduardo mentioned, I'll be talking a bit about some of the more macro side of things, and other speakers will be talking, Park from ADB on the fiscal side, and also then we'll hear from Malaysia on the inequality, equity issues of this. So I'd like to start with just some kind of big picture messages, if you like, just to kind of orient us. The first is, and I apologise somewhat to those from South and West Asia in the audience and other parts of the world, that this is primarily focused on East Asia Pacific, but I think a lot of the issues that will come out are very relevant, particularly to South Asia. The first point, I think, is that rapid ageing, it does pose real risks to growth in Asia, but it's a very varied picture. Those risks are very immediate and quite pressing for a number of the more advanced ages in the region, the Chinas, the Thailands and others. There are emerging risks in others, and they're rapidly emerging, as we heard from Professor Takemi earlier on. And that would be true for Indonesia, Vietnam, soon enough Malaysia and other countries. And then we've got a kind of third group of countries who are and this I think includes a lot of the South Asian countries, who currently are much younger, in fact may well be experiencing a youth bulge rather than, that may be the major policy issue they're confronting. So they have time to prepare for rapid ageing, but I think a key point, even for that group, it may be in the future, but when it happens, and we saw this in Takemi's presentation, it will happen quickly. So it's no use waiting till it happens, and the lessons of Japan are very striking in this area, to start preparing for ageing. So that's the first general point. The second point, though, and this is where we sometimes, I think the point that was made at the very beginning, we shouldn't be too much doom and gloom. That while these risks to growth are real, that some of the risks, and particularly for Asia, are sometimes overstated, and are maybe somewhat less acute in Asia than they have been in other already older parts of the world, and I think in particular of Europe, Central Asia, former Soviet countries and some of the Latin American countries. Despite that, that's no cause for complacency. I think that how those risks play out, they are in many countries risks at the moment rather than catastrophic current realities or anything like that. But that how those risks translate into future impacts will be highly dependent on the policy and behavioural changes that countries at the government level, at the productive firm level and at the societal level adopt to respond to that. And some of those responses in a number of our countries, particularly in East Asia, are really urgent. Some of them are already past urgent and still need to be addressed. So they're some of the kind of bigger picture messages. Brief outline of the presentation. I'll start with some context. Then I'd like to work through some of the major channels through which ageing might be expected, or we already observe it affecting the factors of growth, particularly on the labour side, productivity and savings and capital formation. There are many other factors at play, of course, but for the sake of confining myself to the available time, I'll focus primarily on those. And then at the end, talk briefly on some policy implications, not in any great depth, because I think you'll see at the end that those policy implications are very much the subject of the sessions that we have tomorrow. So firstly, why do we care? And this kind of, I would say, if I was in Europe, I'd say bowl of spaghetti. In Asia, I should say bowl of noodles here. Tells us why, is that developing Asia is already ageing at much lower income levels than currently older nations in Asia and beyond. So here on the horizontal axis you see it's an elderly dependency ratio, a measure of the share of elderly population to working age population, and on the vertical axis is GDP per capita. And what you see there is a very clear picture that some of the currently older countries, Japan, Korea, Singapore and others, were able to sustain very rapid growth, in some cases as they also aged rapidly, and we see Japan there as a prime example, but in others like Singapore and other places as they aged somewhat modestly. The big question, of course, for the developing countries is, do they go more vertically or do they drift horizontally while staying low? And that's the big challenge of sustaining growth as they age. Now, if you look at 2 points of comparison there, China and Thailand right there, you see Thailand, that brown line, is already drifting to the right, aging very rapidly, while growth is maybe not as high as it was historically in these already older countries. China's a more kind of interesting example that its current trajectory looks more like some of these higher countries, but the question will be, does that line flatten as it moves quickly to the right on the horizontal axis? So that's kind of why we care, is that, as Professor Takemi said, if you get old societally at relatively low levels of income, that produces a whole new set of challenges for a society that currently older countries didn't have to deal with. The second reason why we care is if we look backwards. There's a lot of estimates done of the contribution of formerly positive demographics, demographic dividend or whatever you want to call it, on growth in East Asia, and particularly the East Asian tigers during their periods of really rapid growth. And the estimates vary, but it's the role of positive demographics seems to account for between a third and 40% roughly of the growth performance of those very impressive growth periods for East Asian countries. Those growth impacts differ slightly if we compare East Asia to other parts of the world, depending on the extent to which they're driven by a rapid fertility decline or the extent to which they're driven by increased longevity. Now, in Asia, primarily, what we see with ageing is it's driven primarily by fertility decline, very rapid fertility decline. And those impacts on growth are slightly different. I won't go into that today, but it's an important point to note if you're looking at countries who are currently younger and thinking about future ageing. So what that always raises is then, okay, well, if demographics contributed so positively to our past growth, does that demographic dividend turn into a demographic tax? Does the demographic tailwind turn into a demographic headwind? And is that headwind as strong as the tailwind was in the past? And that's sometimes painted over simplistically. I think a really important point to make before we get into each of the channels that may affect growth is that sometimes when you read these really dramatic doomsday scenario, often popular press characterisations of ageing. They impose future demographics on today's policies and today's behaviours. And I think the key point there is that things change. Demographics change, but policies can change, behaviour can change also. And it's really important not to assume that this is some mechanical disaster that countries and societies can do nothing about. So while we know the demographics, or we can largely predict the demographics for most of those people are already born and we know roughly what's going to happen there. We can't fully predict how long they'll live. Maybe there'll be spectacular advances in longevity and things like that, but we can somewhat predict them. How governments and societies respond will really be the key driver. So what I'd like to do now is walk through some of those channels of effects that I mentioned earlier. And rather than try and give you a magical number, for country X, the effect is going to be 2% of GDP or 2.88% of GDP, which is a useful exercise to do, but I think for an audience of this and a set of countries as diverse as this, it's better to talk about the channels. So one is the labour supply effect, how many workers you have in your economy, what you are able to produce things. Secondly is the quality of those workers, the human capital effect. Third is the impact of ageing on savings, and of course savings then how it translates into capital formation investment, which is clearly one of the fundamental drivers of growth in any country. And fourthly, productivity itself, how ageing may or may not affect actual output, productivity of a society. They're the ones I'll focus on. There are some others, and these are much more emerging areas of research, I think, globally, but they're important to mention also, which are more kind of ripple effects on an economy and on growth. One is that the differences in timing and extent of demographic transition are likely to shape international flows of capital, trade and labour. So country X, which is young and saving a lot, for example, will have excess capital available for international capital flows in other parts of the world. Similarly with labour, with countries that may be potential pools of migration to older countries, etc. And then even more kind of, I think, at the edge of research is that ageing itself or the composition of the population may affect other variables that are very important to macroeconomic performance. There's recent work by the IMF, for example, on the effect of ageing on inflation rates and how it may reduce them in older countries. There's also work on returns to different forms of capital. So take the simple example that people on pensions are much more likely to have much more money invested in bonds than equities, things like that. But I won't go into those today, but they're important areas of research, I think. So switching to the specific channels, the first is the labour supply effect, and what we've got here is the change in the share of working age population in various countries between 2010 and 2040. And you see here it's a really diverse picture within East Asia and South Asia. I think if you extend this picture to South Asia, it increases the diversity. The South Asians look more like the right-hand side of this picture than the left-hand. But you see some of the countries and are right in the midst of it already, the Koreas, Singapores, Thailand's, China, where you'll get 10 to 15% reduction in the size of working age population between 2010 and 2040. The middle group are an interesting group. It doesn't look like a very interesting group here, and I would take that maybe from Vietnam to Cambodia roughly in this picture. That group over this period we're looking at, it looks relatively flat, and in aggregate terms it is. But what you've got are two dynamics underlying that. One is that they are, and Vietnam is a great example, starting either right now or very soon to age very rapidly. But at the same time, their labour force is increasing at the same time in absolute numbers. So you've got two forces at play in this middle group of countries. In the left-hand group of countries, the Koreas and others, both the labour or the working age population is falling in absolute terms and increasing as a share. And then the right-hand side are the younger countries, and we've got a number of them here, Laos, Timor and others, where they are still in the midst of what we would classically call a demographic dividend period. So it's a very diverse picture. I think the ones we obviously hear about and worry about the most are the ones on the left, but perhaps the most interesting cases are these ones that have, until now or until, for a few more years, have a demographic tailwind, but that tailwind is dying out and they'll be forced back onto the more classic forms of stimulating growth. That's a kind of standard thing where we look at working age population as 15 to 64, standard international ILO measure. One piece of good news, and this is one of the reasons why I said maybe the picture in Asia is not quite as gloomy as it's sometimes painted, is that people in East Asia often work well beyond that standard definition of working age, particularly if they're rural people. And here you've got, these are employment rates of people by age, gender and location. So they fall with age in all countries, as you see. But I think the really interesting thing is here is just how high those employment rates remain for many people into their 60s and sometimes even well into their 70s. So that's a kind of mitigating effect on that labour supply impact that we often are concerned about. One other nuance of this, I think, and where, again, Asia is a little different in a negative way, is that if you look at those lines, and probably if your eyesight's as bad as mine, you can't see all the details of those lines, but the basic story is that urban people are withdrawing from work significantly earlier than rural people. Rural people in Asia are basically working till they drop. They're working till they can't work physically anymore. So you don't need to worry about those guys somehow or other taking it easy from age 50. You do, though, in some countries need to worry about urban populations and particularly urban women. In China, if you're a blue-collar urban woman in the formal sector, you can retire when you're 50. In Vietnam, you can retire when you're 55 if you're a woman, at ages when people are still highly productive. And because they're urban people, they're also better educated people as a rule. So these are countries that on a macro side are trying to move up the value chain, increase productivity, and yet they're letting large chunks of their populations, or forcing them sometimes through pension or other reasons, to retire far earlier than they should. That contrasts to places like the former Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, where the most educated people work the longest. So you're tying one hand behind your back, essentially, in terms of productivity, growth, and in terms of output. Nonetheless, I think the good news is Asians, on average, work long and they work hard. These people, we also looked in our study at how many hours they're working. Some of these 70 to 75-year-old Chinese men are working between 35 and 40 hours a week, and they're providing between 25 and 30 hours of care a week to grandchildren and others. So they're not just laying around kind of doing the crossword and taking it easy. The second channel that I'd like to focus on is the quality of labour effect. And this is another area where East Asia in particular is in a good place, relatively, or certainly relative to some other parts of the world. On the left-hand side, you have the future estimates of educational levels by country. This is for people's secondary education and above. And you see universally that those increases are really very, very sharp by global standards and by historical standards. So the human capital in the future population, even if there are fewer of them in the labour force, is going to be much better. That's a little simplistic, as we all know. One can't just look at access rates, and there are real quality concerns in a number of countries, many countries. Even countries like Thailand, in rural areas, about 50% of secondary children are considered functionally illiterate. So the fact that they're in school doesn't necessarily mean they're acquiring the skills that will improve their future productivity, But the story overall is a very positive one for East Asia. And then on the right-hand side is the very simple story that as well as living longer, people are living healthier longer. So in principle, barring other constraints of policy or behaviour, they will be able to work longer and more productively in future. So the quality of labour effect is really quite a promising one in this part of the world. These are global. To some extent, this is happening in many regions of the world, but I think these improvements are particularly impressive in East Asia. One wrinkle on that, on the health side, is that whilst we've seen these, on the right-hand side, quite impressive gains in short periods in healthy life expectancy, those gains are under threat. And they're under threat primarily from non-communicable diseases. So the currently middle-aged generation in most of our countries is not as healthy as their parents were. They're smoking too much, they're sitting down at their job rather than being physically active, they're probably drinking too much. I sound like when my mother talks to me. And generally their lifestyles are creating a lot of NCD risks that create risks for continuing this kind of performance in future. The third channel is the productivity channel, and there are three elements to that perhaps that I'd like to speak to. One is the question, are older workers less productive than younger workers? And that's a function of two things. One is how much they're producing of whatever they're producing, whether it's goods or services. And the second is how much they're being paid to produce that. Obviously, productivity is a function of what you produce and what it costs to produce it. The second way it may affect productivity is if older workers are inherently less entrepreneurial than younger workers. If that's the case, there's a risk that they won't contribute as much to generating new technologies, new ideas, innovation, and that in itself, which is such an important input to growth, will be compromised. And then the third point is a kind of mechanical one, but it's an important one. If, in fact, societies in future have fewer people of working age or a smaller labour force, however defined, but they have a given stock of capital, they have a given stock of money to invest in production, then that given stock of capital per worker will be higher. If I have $100 to invest with 100 workers, it's $1 a head, and if I have 90 workers, it's going to be $1.10 a head or so. So there's a positive potential impact there because the capital intensity per worker will be higher, and we would hope and expect that the output as a result of a given worker would be higher. So looking at those three things, the first one I think is a question that Eduardo is always asking himself: are older workers less productive? Or maybe his staff is always asking him that question just to tease him, perhaps. And here it's a really interesting picture. I think the short answer is the picture is not so clear. There's a lot of assumption in society, and it's pretty global, that as people get beyond a certain age, into their 50s, certainly into their 60s, that somehow or other their productivity falls off a cliff. And, maybe it's a good idea to kind of shuffle them into retirement. In fact, the research, both cognitive, labour market research, economic research, shows a much more mixed picture. So first thing, if we look at the more kind of cognitive side, certain abilities seem to continue well into your 50s and 60s. The primary ones are what they call crystallized abilities or tacit procedural abilities. And this is the kind of stuff where I've been doing something for so long, when somebody throws me a similar kind of task again, I kind of know how to cut to the chase, how to be efficient in addressing that task. Whereas the young person has to work through it all and learn it all for the first time and that kind of thing. So it's embedded knowledge, that kind of thing. In contrast, what they call fluid abilities, which are the kind of problem-solving skills of very immediate problems that need quick solutions, do tend to deteriorate in your 40s or so. So there are certain abilities that older people continue to have, certain ones that do appear to decline. That said, though, it's very clear across a number of countries that over time, that period of good cognitive performance is increasing over time in much of the world. So the cognitive abilities of older people are not standing still. They're improving over time in societies across the world. And then there are some other things that probably if you're an employer or you run a large department somewhere, you know intuitively. Older workers have lower absenteeism than younger workers. They don't kind of not turn up because they've been out partying the night before or, getting up to no good. And they also change jobs less frequently. Now, in some countries, that less change of jobs is maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing. But if you look at a country like China, one of the biggest challenges of firms is retaining workers and investing enough in their training or having enough of a future for that worker in their firm to invest in training and their productivity. So some of these features of older workers are really positive ones also in terms of their attractiveness to employer, the competitiveness of them as workers. If we look from the economic side, it's a really, I would say, almost muddled picture. There have been many, many studies in many countries over time. They've used different methods. They've asked supervisors of workers. They've looked at the quality and quantity of output of workers. They've matched what employers say and what workers say. They produce all kinds of questions. And different measures of productivity seem to produce different results. And different, whoever you ask seems at times to produce different results. So it's really not as definitive a picture as is sometimes painted, that universally older workers kind of get less productive with age. And it's a surprising, for such an important issue, it's been studied a lot, but I think the findings globally and over time are remarkably inconclusive. The most recent review was done by David Bloom and some co-authors for European countries, EU countries. And if anything, their results, I think, are in a more positive direction than the past on the productivity of older workers. And that may reflect some of these other factors we talked about, increasing cognitive skills, increasing human capital, etc. In developing Asia, there's remarkably little research on this question. And it's clearly an area that, with the advance of ageing, is going to need a lot more work. To try and establish, do we see similar patterns or similar kind of uncertainty than we do in the more old parts of the world currently. But one thing we can say, if we don't focus so much on what people produce but what it costs for them to produce something, is that there are quite a number of countries in East Asia where there are certainly problems on the price side. So they have seniority wage systems where, because I have another birthday every year, I get paid more, whether I'm more productive or not next year. Those kind of wage systems clearly are going to become more and more of an economic drain in countries that are ageing. And we see in the region already that some of the countries who've had that very strongly, Korea is a great example at the moment, are trying desperately to weaken this effect of seniority wage systems. And there's been a lot of political debate in Korea about the so-called peak wage system that they're trying to introduce to counteract this. A really nice example I like mentioning is Samsung. Samsung we think of as, a great innovator, great tech company, all that kind of thing. From age 55, if you stay with Samsung, they reduce your wage 10% every year. That might be a bit of a blunt tool, but it's certainly a very strong tool to try and offset the history of seniority wage in those countries. The final one on entrepreneurialism, this is even fuzzier, I would say. Are older workers less entrepreneurial? There's a lot of kind of questions that try to get to this in some of the global attitudes and other surveys. These are a couple of results. One is people who manage their own company on top. And the bottom one is people who plan in the next few years to do a startup, to set up their own company. And the age, as you move, the yellow bars are the oldest group and the blue bars are the youngest group. It's a quite interesting picture, I think. It's, you can't really impose a strong pattern on that, I think. If you look at Japan in the top frame, you see that, in fact, those who've got their own companies increases with age, in contrast to, say, Latin America, or that it's fairly flat in the United States. In contrast, if you look at the bottom bar, those who are planning to start new businesses, and look at China, clearly the young people are the ones who are appearing more entrepreneurial there. Whereas in contrast, Japan is probably at a fairly low level of entrepreneurialism at whatever age you're at. So it's quite a complex picture there again. I think the thing that I take away from all that on the productivity side is that we need to question our assumptions, that older people are always going to be less productive or automatically less productive in all dimensions of their work, because clearly that's not the case. If we move on to savings now, and as we all know, I mean, savings is where it gets kind of one remove. We can all understand why more workers might be good for output and things like that. Savings, the channel is a bit more indirect, in the sense that if you have more savings, you generate more capital for investment, which then is put into productive purposes and hopefully converts into growth. This is another area, I think, where East Asia is perhaps in a somewhat more promising position than some other parts of the world. The classic thing in economics is what they call the life cycle hypothesis of savings, where you kind of get given money by your parents or supported when you're young, you save as much as you can when you're working, and you dis-save, as they call it, or spend what you've saved when you're old. And certainly, as we saw from Eduardo's presentation, that pattern at one level does hold, but it may not hold as strongly in East Asia and other parts of Asia as it does elsewhere in the world, for a few reasons. First, household savings rates are pretty high and pretty stable in East Asia compared to other regions of the world. Most countries in East Asia, household savings are pretty robust if you compare them, say, to countries like my own, Australia, United States and others. There are exceptions. Thailand is one, where savings are low, debt is high. So one can't always assume, but on average, East Asia has high household savings rates. Second is that people are generally saving till later in life than we see in OECD countries. Third, for countries that have grown a lot recently, China is a country that's been studied in this regard, savings rates have increased at all ages in China over the last decade. So whether or not young people are saving more than older people in relative terms is a question, but in absolute terms, everybody at every age has increased their savings levels in China as part of the growth story there. One thing we really need to understand better is why we see these high patterns of savings and other things in East Asia. As far as we know from surveys and other sources, and just common sense, a lot of it is precautionary saving. When health systems are not complete in their coverage, or people are not well insured, or they don't have pensions, pension coverage is low, naturally I'm going to save a lot during my life to prepare for old age, for poor health, or supporting myself when I can no longer work. So a question there is, how will that change as social security systems change? And we'll observe the answer to that, but it's an important question, and one that Park may speak to later. And then the final point, I think, which is also important for East Asia, it's one of these quantity-quality points, is that in a number of countries in East Asia at the moment, the savings are not always very well channeled into investment, or they're inefficiently channeled into investment. So again, I don't like to cite China too often, but I work a lot on China, so I'm more familiar with it. Bank savings in China, savings are high, households save a lot, there's a lot of money in the banking system, but that banking system is largely or often channeling money to state-owned enterprises which don't use it as efficiently as the private sector. It's not just true of China. Repressed financial sectors or partially repressed financial sectors are quite common in many parts of our region. So there's a lot of potential there with reform of financial sectors to channel savings more productively in future for a given level of savings. At the household level, what it comes down to is two things. There are always going to be two factors at play in determining how much I save or how much a society saves. One is what they call the compositional effect. So how many people as a share of working age in their high savings periods of life relative to those in old age in their lower savings period of life have we got relative to one another across a whole population? And the second thing is what a behavioural effect is, that if I know that life expectancy is increasing, if I know that I'm going to live to 80 or 90 whereas my parents lived to 60, when I'm in that working period, I'm sure as hell going to save a bit more than my parents probably needed to anticipate when they were in their working period. So these two factors kind of may counterbalance one another. What we see in East Asia is that it appears, and it may be changing and we really need to continue to look at it, is that the behavioural effect seems to be somewhat stronger than the compositional effect. So that is to say that people are realising they're living longer and they are changing their savings behaviour and saving more in response to that observation, even though the society as a whole is ageing and there may be some offset of that. This is by no means definitive, and I think reasonable people disagree on it. If you see the study by Lee at the bottom, it finds very mixed effects. But at least at the moment, it doesn't seem to be, kind of completely tilted towards the compositional effect. The more worrying effect, though, on savings, that was really households that we were focusing on, is government savings. Now, Park will speak about this much more, so I don't want to dwell on it. But the biggest risks that we find in this region on savings are really coming through the budgetary and the fiscal channel. On the left there, you see some of the projected increase in pension spending in a number of East Asian countries as a share of GDP. Sadly, Vietnam is a gold medal winner in this regard. But you see there are some real kind of fiscal pressures of the pension system that are coming and will affect government saving and therefore aggregate saving. And then on the right-hand side, this is certainly one where the pieces of spaghetti are completely confusing. But the bottom line of that is it really matters in that situation where you start from and what kind of debt stock you have in government to start with. So if you have an old population with high debt to start with, you see that blue line at the top, it can really spiral with ageing and with the kind of fiscal pressures that come with ageing. In contrast, if you have low levels of debt, a relatively young society, the picture is not as worrying. So there's some, I guess, general channels that I wanted to discuss. Just two more slides on, and this is really kind of panoramic kind of points on the policy implications because we'll get into them much more. As I said at the beginning, for some countries these issues are really pressing. They are right now issues, or they are 5 years ago issues that haven't yet been addressed. For others they're emerging issues, and for others they need to be thinking about this even now. The first is clearly policy behavioural change to supplement the workforce. In our study we look at a number of countries on different options here: female labour force participation, immigration, increasing working lives, etc. We can say for almost across the board, female labour force participation is the biggest single measure you can take to mitigate that labour force effect. It's true in Japan, it's true in Korea, it's true almost across the board, and particularly in South Asia, it's extremely true also, we know. The second one, which is is really tricky is immigration. Because the pace of ageing and the stage of ageing differs so much across the region, there's huge potential in this region for immigration to help offset the ageing challenges of one country, but also introduce kind of capital and remittances and other things to the younger countries. But we know politically it's extremely difficult in every country, as the US elections are showing us at the moment, amongst other things. There are a host of things that I think we'll get into tomorrow. Second one is clearly on the human capital side. Asia is in many cases already doing the right thing here, but it needs to continue doing the right thing as far as general and further levels of education goes. And it will also, I think, need to look at the two ends of skill formation either side of general education. One is early child development, nutrition and other things, and the other is lifelong learning. Even in Japan and Korea, the performance on lifelong learning and investing in older workers is not that great. And so that's something that clearly many countries will confront and will put new demands on education systems. We won't just all go to school and possibly university, stop when we're in our 20s and never study again. If we're going to work much longer, if technology changes quicker, if we all have 5 careers, that's not going to be enough to keep us productive throughout our working lives. On the fiscal side, and I think Park will touch on this, quite a number of countries in the region still need to undertake significant pension reforms. One is on the area of retirement age. Some countries have progressed, others, I mentioned China and Vietnam as examples, but there are others, where retirement ages have not evolved to reflect longevity, and as a result, kind of emerging fiscal pressures. But also, if you think about the younger generation, to finance some of these pension systems, you either have to put up taxes or adjust the benefits somehow or other. There was a study done for Vietnam which showed that by 2100, if you didn't change the pension system at all and use the current demographics, the tax rate on workers would have to be 80% of their salary. Now, clearly, no society can tolerate that and remain a competitive society. So pension reforms are, in many countries, a real priority. This is an area actually where Japan, and Takemi could speak to this, I'm sure, offers lots of really interesting lessons for a super age society, positive lessons. And then finally is the kind of reorientation of health and long-term care systems. Almost across the board, our countries are very hospital-centric, don't have enough emphasis on primary and preventive care, and we know as people get older, a lot of our conditions are not things that need me to stay in hospital forever. They need me to have, take blood pressure pills, to monitor my diabetes, perhaps to take cholesterol pills, whatever it may be. But it's case management, it's not hospitalisation. And systems to adjust from their current hospital centrism to that is challenging. And to produce the health workers that can make that happen is very challenging. And also, I won't go into it now, but long-term care systems are related to that and reforms of that. So that's that. That's the report that Eduardo mentioned. I should mention just as an amusing aside on this study, Live Long and Prosper. Those of you who watch the television show Star Trek would know that this is the Vulcan greeting of Mr. Spock in Star Trek, Live Long and Prosper. When we were just about to publish this report, our copyright people rang up in a panic and said, we'll have to get permission to use the Vulcan greeting. So we contacted CBS or whoever now controls Star Trek, and their legal department gave us permission to use this title on condition that we didn't put spaceships on the cover. So you can be my witnesses that there is no spaceship visible anyway on this cover. It did tempt us to put a spaceship on the cover, I have to say, when we heard that. So anyway, that's all from me. Thank you very much.